If you're a researcher or educator still doing things the slow way, this video might change how you work. A year ago, my research workflow looked completely normal. Read papers, take notes, get stuck, repeat. Then I started testing AI tools, not because I wanted to save time, but because a colleague asked me a simple question: why are you still doing this the slow way? I didn't have a good answer. So I started experimenting, quietly, without telling anyone. Partly because I wasn't sure it would actually work, and partly because there's a strange kind of embarrassment in admitting a machine might be better at part of your job than you are. 3 workflows quietly stuck. Not because they're flashy, not because they made headlines or trended on social media. They stuck because they actually changed how I think, how I write, and how I teach. Here's what they are, how I actually use them, and where they still fall apart. The first workflow is literature synthesis. If you've ever opened 12 tabs of papers and tried to hold all of them in your head at once, you already know the problem. Your brain wasn't built to cross-reference 40 pages of dense academic writing while also trying to spot the one contradiction that actually matters. I used to spend entire afternoons just building a mental map of who agreed with whom, which findings supported, which claims, and where the quiet disagreements were hiding between the lines. It was slow. And worse, it was the kind of slow that doesn't feel productive even while you're doing it. Now I feed a batch of papers into a single AI notebook tool and ask it to summarize each source individually. That part is easy, and honestly, most tools can do it reasonably well. But the summary was never the hard part of my job. The second question is the one that actually matters. Where do these sources disagree? That single question changed everything about how I use these tools. Most AI systems will happily generate a tidy summary without being asked twice. Very few will surface real tension between sources unless you explicitly force the question. Once I started asking it directly, I found contradictions I would have otherwise spent a full day hunting for by hand, buried in methodology sections or hidden inside a single footnote. This didn't replace my reading. I want to be clear about that, because it's the part people misunderstand most. It replaced my note-taking. I still read every source closely, sentence by sentence, because that's where the actual understanding happens. But I stopped wasting hours rebuilding a map that the tool can now build for me in minutes. The output isn't perfect, and I don't pretend it is. It hallucinates connections sometimes, confidently stating a link between 2 papers that doesn't actually exist once you check the primary source. So I treat it the way I'd treat a sharp but slightly overconfident graduate student. A useful first draft of the map, always verified against the original text, before it goes anywhere near my actual writing. The second workflow is research writing, specifically the blank page problem that every academic knows far too well. If you've written a paper, you know the first paragraph is almost always the hardest one to produce. Not because the ideas are unclear in your head, but because you're trying to write and structure at the exact same time, and those are 2 very different cognitive tasks pretending to be one. I stopped doing that. Now I dictate my raw thinking out loud into my phone. Messy, unstructured, full of half-finished sentences, and the kind of rambling you'd never let a colleague see. And I let an AI tool turn that rough transcript into a structured first draft. The key detail here, the one that took me a while to figure out, is that I'm not asking it to write my paper. I'm asking it to organize my paper. There's a real and important difference between those 2 requests. When AI generates the ideas from scratch, the writing sounds generic, and worse, it sounds like every other AI-assisted paper currently flooding academic journals, all with that same flattened, overly balanced tone. When AI organizes ideas that are already mine, spoken in my own words, and shaped by my own reasoning, the voice stays mine. Only the structure gets faster. I still rewrite every paragraph by hand afterward, sentence by sentence, but I'm rewriting a scaffold instead of staring at an empty page for 45 minutes trying to find an opening line. That single shift cut my first draft time by what feels like half, though I'll admit I haven't put an actual stopwatch on it. I don't think you need one to notice the difference once you've lived both versions of the process. The third workflow is the one that surprised me most, because it has nothing to do with research directly. It's teaching preparation. Every week, I used to spend hours turning dense research findings into something a room full of undergraduate students could actually follow without a PhD's worth of background knowledge. That translation step, from expert language down to plain, accessible language, is its own distinct skill, and it's genuinely exhausting to do from scratch every single week of a semester. Now, I use AI as a first-pass translator, nothing more. I feed it my research notes or a paper I want to teach that week, and I ask it to explain the core idea the way you'd explain it to someone smart but completely unfamiliar with the field. Then, I take that explanation and rebuild it entirely in my own teaching voice, because the AI version is almost always too smooth, too generic, and missing the specific examples and small human details that make a concept actually click for my particular students in my particular classroom. But it gives me a starting shape to react to instead of a blank slide staring back at me at 11 at night. Lecture prep that used to eat an entire evening now takes a fraction of that time, and the extra time doesn't just disappear. It goes straight into the part that actually matters, thinking harder about how to explain the idea better, finding the right analogy, anticipating where students will get confused, instead of spending that same energy just summarizing content in the first place. None of these 3 workflows replace my judgment, and I think that's the part people get most wrong when they talk about AI in research and academia. The tools are genuinely fast at the parts of the work that were never really the hard part to begin with: reading quickly, structuring information, summarizing content at scale. The actual hard part of academic work, deciding what matters, spotting what's subtly wrong or overstated, explaining a complex idea clearly to another human being who's never encountered it before, that's still entirely on me, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, no matter how good these tools get. What changed isn't the thinking itself. It's how much of my week is left over for that thinking, once the repetitive busy work gets cleared out of the way first. If I'm honest, I resisted this for longer than I should have. There's a certain identity wrapped up in doing research the hard way, spending hours on tasks that feel effortful, because effort has always felt like proof of rigor. But effort spent rebuilding a mental map that a machine can build in 90 seconds isn't rigor. It's just habit dressed up as diligence. The rigor is still there. It just moved to a different part of the process, the part where I'm actually checking, questioning, and thinking, instead of the part where I was simply organizing information by hand, because that's what research always looked like before. There were mistakes along the way, and it's worth being honest about them instead of pretending this was a clean, linear improvement. Early on, I trusted a synthesized summary without checking the source, and I nearly cited a claim that the original paper never actually made. The AI hadn't lied exactly. It had blended two related findings from different sections into something that sounded coherent but wasn't accurate. That mistake taught me the rule I still follow today. Treat every AI output as a draft written by someone who read quickly but not carefully. Useful for direction, never for final wording. Never for a citation, never for a number that ends up in a paper or a lecture slide, without me personally verifying it against the original source first. I also learned that the tools work best when I give them less freedom, not more. A vague prompt produces a vague, generic answer. A specific prompt, one that tells the tool exactly what question to answer and what to ignore, produces something I can actually use. That took longer to learn than I expected, mostly because the marketing around these tools implies you can just hand over a task and walk away. You can't, not yet, and maybe not ever. And I've stopped waiting for that to become true. If you're thinking about trying any of this yourself, my advice is to start with just one of these three workflows, not all three at once. Pick whichever part of your week currently feels the most repetitive and the least intellectually demanding, because that's almost always where the time savings show up fastest, and where the risk of the tool getting something important wrong is lowest. For me, that was literature synthesis. For a colleague of mine in a different department, it was grant writing structure. For someone else, it was simply turning messy meeting notes into a clean summary. The specific workflow matters less than the underlying principle. Use the tool for the mechanical parts of the process, keep the judgment for yourself, and always verify before anything leaves your desk. A year ago, my research workflow looked completely normal. Now it doesn't, and I don't think I'm going back.
But I also want to be honest about the part of this story that doesn't fit neatly into a tidy conclusion. Because the truth is messier than, I found 3 workflows and now everything is better. What actually happened is that my relationship with my own expertise shifted in a way I'm still making sense of. For years, being good at my job meant being the person who could hold the most information in his head at once, who could synthesize fastest, who could produce the clean draft under pressure. That was the currency. That was, if I'm honest, a fair chunk of my professional identity. And when a tool started doing pieces of that faster than I could, it didn't just save me time, it quietly asked me a harder question. If the machine can do the fast part, what exactly am I bringing to the table? I don't think that question has a comfortable answer yet. Not for me, and not for anyone else in this field pretending they've already figured it out. What I've landed on, at least for now, is that the value was never really in the speed. It was always in the judgment sitting on top of the speed, and that judgment doesn't transfer to a model no matter how good the model gets at mimicking the shape of expert reasoning.
If this saved you even 1 hour of work, do me a favor and like, share, and subscribe so more researchers and educators can find workflows like this too.